Ancient Dragon Protocols reactivated after a human dared to say yes. Part 1. The data crystal fell from the broken storage unit and rolled across the floor, stopping at David Reed's boot. He picked it up, turning the small object over in his palm. Strange symbols covered its surface, glowing faintly in the dim light of the archive basement. David had been repairing damaged equipment on Meridian 7 Station for 3 years, and he had never seen anything like this before. Most people would have logged it and moved on. David was not most people. He pressed his thumb against the crystal's surface. The symbols blazed bright, and suddenly the world shifted. A holographic interface burst into existence around him, projecting images he could barely understand. Ancient script flowed like water through the air, and somehow, impossibly, David could read it. One question appeared before him, written in letters that seemed older than stars. The translation formed in his mind without effort. "Will you bear the weight?" David should have hesitated. He should have called his supervisor or contacted the research division. Instead, he spoke the word that would change everything. Yes, the crystal exploded with light. David felt something rush into his mind, images and memories that were not his own. He saw massive creatures flying through space without ships, their scales reflecting starlight. He saw worlds burning and civilizations falling silent. He saw beings of impossible size making decisions that affected billions. Then the vision stopped, leaving him gasping on the floor. Alarms screamed throughout the archive. Red lights flashed in patterns David recognized as maximum security alerts. He tried to stand, but his legs would not cooperate. The crystal had fused to his palm, its surface now warm against his skin. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Commander Hastings arrived first, flanked by 6 security officers. The human woman's face was tight with anger. "David Reed, what have you done? Step away from that artifact immediately." David raised his hand, showing the crystal embedded in his palm. "I cannot, it will not let go." Behind Hastings, an elderly Torgasian shuffled forward. Professor Aldrin had 4 arms and skin like rough leather, covered in the ritual scars of his people. His multiple eyes widened as he saw the symbols on the crystal. "Impossible," he whispered. "These markings are from the Draconis Collective. They have been extinct for 50,000 years. The crystal pulsed, and suddenly every screen in the archive activated at once. A star map appeared, showing 7 points of light scattered across the galaxy. David felt knowledge flooding into his thoughts, information he had never learned but somehow now possessed. "The sanctuaries," he said quietly. "They are waking up." Professor Aldrin moved closer, his scientific curiosity overriding caution. "What did you do, young human? What did you activate?" David looked at his hand, watching patterns of light move beneath his skin. "I answered a question. I said yes." Hastings grabbed his shoulder. "Yes to what?" Before David could respond, a sound filled the archive. It was not heard through ears but felt through bones, a vibration that made reality itself seem to shiver. Every being in the room froze. The sound was impossibly deep, carrying weight that pressed against their minds. It spoke, and the words formed in their thoughts rather than their ears. "The first sanctuary awaits. Come alone, young one, or come not at all. The others are waking, and they will have questions." The voice faded, leaving silence that felt heavier than any sound. Professor Aldrin's hands trembled as he accessed his datapad. "I need to research this immediately." The Draconis Collective were not just another extinct species. They were peacekeepers, guardians who maintained order across the galaxy before the current council existed. Their disappearance created the power vacuum that led to the formation of modern galactic government. Hastings was already calling for additional security. "We need to quarantine this entire section. David Reed is under arrest pending investigation. Nobody touches anything until the Council Science Division arrives." David felt the crystal warm against his palm. Images continued to flash through his mind. He saw a moon orbiting a red giant star. He saw a crystalline structure hidden in a canyon, existing in a way that made his human brain struggle to comprehend. He knew, without understanding how he knew, that he had to go there. Over the next 6 hours, David sat in a holding cell while officials debated his fate. Through the small window, he could see ships arriving at the station. Representatives from a dozen species had come to investigate the signal that pulsed from the crystal. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a threat. David called it a responsibility he had accidentally accepted. Professor Aldrin visited him during the night cycle. The old scholar's eyes were tired but excited. I have been studying the Draconis legends for 40 years, he said softly. According to the ancient texts, they created a failsafe before they vanished. A test, they called it. Only someone who chose freely, without coercion or complete understanding, could reactivate their systems. You passed that test, David Reed. I did not know there was a test, David replied. I just answered a question. Aldrin's laugh was dry. That was the point. The dragons believed that true choice could only exist in the absence of perfect information. They wanted someone who would say yes to responsibility without knowing all the consequences. Humans have a reputation for that kind of behavior. Is that a compliment? David asked. The professor tilted his head. That depends on what happens next. Through the cell window, David could see the stars. Somewhere out there, 7 sanctuaries were waiting. 7 beings were stirring from sleep that had lasted longer than some civilizations. And somehow a maintenance worker from Earth had become the key to whatever came next. The crystal pulsed again, and David felt coordinates burning into his awareness. He knew exactly where he needed to go. The question was whether anyone would let him leave, and if they did, whether he would survive what waited at the first sanctuary. Commander Hastings appeared at the cell door. The council has made their decision, she said. You are confined to the station indefinitely. The artifact will be surgically removed and placed in secure storage. David looked at the crystal in his palm, then at the star map that still glowed in his mind. He thought about the voice that had spoken, ancient and vast, carrying the weight of millennia. He thought about his sister, who had died because officials delayed too long making decisions during an emergency. He thought about all the times in history when following proper procedure had led to disaster. Sometimes, David realized the right choice and the legal choice were not the same thing. He began planning his escape. Ancient dragon protocols reactivated after a human dared to say yes. Part 2. Professor Aldrin's hands moved quickly across the security panel. The old Torgasian scholar had 4 arms, which made hacking multiple systems simultaneously much easier than most species could manage. Maintenance tunnels all over Meridian 7 were suddenly reporting false emergencies, drawing security forces away from the detention block. David Reed stood behind him, still wearing restraints on his wrists. You are risking your career for this, he said quietly. The professor did not look away from his work. I am risking much more than that. If the council discovers I helped you escape, I will spend my remaining years in prison. But I did not dedicate my life to studying the ancient ones only to watch politicians bury this discovery in committee meetings for the next decade. The airlock is 3 corridors ahead. I have prepared a small shuttle with enough supplies for a week. The coordinates are already programmed. Why are you helping me? David asked. Aldrin finally turned, his multiple eyes focusing on the human. Because in all my years of research, I never found anyone who could activate Draconis technology. Because the ancient texts say the dragons will only wake for someone pure of intention, and because you remind me of myself when I was young, before I learned to let caution overcome curiosity. Now go, before I regret this decision even more than I already do. David wanted to thank him properly, but alarms were already beginning to shift their patterns. Security would realize the misdirection soon. He ran. The shuttle was exactly where Aldrin promised, a small vessel designed for short-range transport between stations. David sealed the airlock behind him and initiated launch sequences. Through the viewport, he saw security forces rushing toward the hangar bay, but they were too late. The shuttle jumped to faster-than-light speed, and Meridian 7 vanished behind him. The journey to the coordinates took 18 hours. David spent the time studying the information flowing from the crystal into his mind. It was not like reading or watching a recording. Instead, knowledge simply appeared in his thoughts as he needed it. He learned that the Draconis Collective had not been a government or an empire. They had been individuals, 7 beings who lived for millions of years and chose to protect younger civilizations from threats those civilizations could not comprehend. But something had gone wrong. David saw flashes of memory that were not his own, pride turning into arrogance, protection becoming control. Species that resented their guardians rather than thanking them. The dragons had realized their mistake too late. They had become what they sought to prevent, tyrants who imposed their will because they believed they knew best. So they had withdrawn. They had created a test and placed themselves in stasis, hoping that one day someone would come who could help them find a better way. Someone who would say yes not out of obligation or fear, but out of genuine choice. David was not certain he was that person. He was just a maintenance worker who fixed broken equipment. But he had said yes, and now he was committed. The shuttle dropped out of faster-than-light travel near a barren moon. Scanners showed nothing unusual at first, just rock and dust orbiting a red giant star. But when David looked with his own eyes, he saw something that instruments could not detect. Reality bent in a canyon system below, creating patterns that made his head hurt when he tried to focus on them. He landed the shuttle at the canyon's edge and walked toward the distortion. With each step, the world became stranger. Shadows fell at wrong angles, sound echoed before it was made, and there, at the canyon's heart, stood a structure that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was a fortress, a temple, a living thing, and a thought-given form all at once. David's hand touched the entrance, and the crystal in his palm blazed with recognition. The structure opened, revealing a chamber vast enough to contain cities. And within that chamber, something massive stirred. She was called Grandmother Asher, and she was beautiful in a way that human words could not properly describe. Her scales shifted between solid matter and pure energy, colors that did not exist in normal space flowing across her form. She was the size of a small starship, and when she moved, the air itself seemed to sing. Her eyes opened, each one containing galaxies of thought and memory. Those eyes fixed on David, and he felt his entire existence weighed in a single moment. "You are small." Her voice resonated through his bones. "And yet you carry the key. Explain yourself, young one. Why have you awakened me from dreams that were meant to last until stars grew cold?" David found his voice, though it felt tiny compared to hers. "I touched a crystal. It asked me a question. I said yes." Asher's laugh was like music played on instruments made of light. "So simple, so perfectly, wonderfully simple. The others will not believe me when I tell them. 50,000 years we waited, and the one who finally answers is a creature who barely lives a century. The universe has a sense of humor after all." She lowered her massive head, bringing one eye level with David's entire body. "Do you understand what you have done, small one? Do you comprehend the responsibility you accepted?" "No," David admitted. "But I am willing to learn, honest and brave, though perhaps too much of one and not enough of the other." "Very well, I will teach you. But first you must face the test." The chamber changed. Suddenly David stood in a different place, watching a city burn. People screamed as ships rained fire from above. He knew somehow that this was memory. This had actually happened. Asher's voice surrounded him. "I could have stopped this," she said. "My power was sufficient to destroy the attacking fleet, but doing so would have interfered with this species' natural development. They needed to learn the consequences of their aggression. I chose to let them suffer so they would grow. Was I right?" David watched families die. He watched children burn, his stomach twisted with horror. How can this ever be right? The scene changed. Now he saw the same species thousands of years later, having learned from their tragedy. They were peaceful now, trading with other civilizations, sharing knowledge instead of weapons. Because of their historical suffering, they had developed strong ethics about the use of force. They had become teachers of peace to younger species. Ashir spoke again. "Because I did not interfere, millions died, but billions more lived better lives. The survivors created something beautiful from their pain. If I had saved them, they would have continued their aggression until they destroyed themselves completely. I calculated probabilities across thousands of potential timelines. Non-interference gave them the best chance of survival. Was I right?" David felt tears on his face. "I do not know." The simulation ended, returning them to the sanctuary chamber. Asher's eyes held something that might have been approval. "That is the correct answer. Anyone who claims certainty in such choices is either lying or a fool. We dragons became fools. We believed our age gave us wisdom, our power gave us right. We imposed our solutions because we could not imagine being wrong." She touched David with one claw, impossibly gentle despite its size. A scale detached from her form and settled onto his hand, merging with the crystal already there. "This is my gift," she said. "It will help you understand the language of dragons and access knowledge you will need, but it will also change you. The more you use it, the less human you will become. Choose carefully how often you call upon its power." David looked at the scale, feeling new knowledge blooming in his mind. "How many more sanctuaries must I find?" 6, Ashir replied. "Each dragon is different. Some will welcome you, some will test you as I have, and one will try to devour you, for he has forgotten himself in dreams of endless hunger. You must wake them all or the protocol will fail. What is the protocol? David asked. Asher's form began to shift, preparing to leave the sanctuary. It is a warning system and a defense network. It is a promise we made before we slept. And now that you have activated it, you will soon understand why we created it. Something is coming, young one. Something that hungers for civilizations like yours. We hid from it for 50,000 years. Now we must face it again, and this time we will need help. She moved toward the entrance, her massive form impossibly graceful. Come. We have 6 more dragons to wake, and very little time. The sensors I left in deep space are already detecting movement. The Voidborn have begun their harvest. David followed her, understanding that his simple life was gone forever. He had said yes to a question, and that single word had bound him to something far larger than himself. There was no going back now, only forward into whatever came next. Ancient Dragon Protocols reactivated. After a human dared to say yes, Part 3 water covered everything on Poseidon's Reach, an ocean world where waves reached heights that could swallow mountains. David's shuttle descended through storm clouds, following coordinates that pulled at his mind like hooks. Grandmother Asher traveled beside him in her own vessel, a craft that seemed to be made of solidified starlight. The Delphir people lived beneath these waves, she had explained during the journey. They remember us as tyrants. We controlled their ocean currents to prevent catastrophic storms, but we did not ask their permission. We saved millions of their lives, and they grew to hate us for it. Ironhide Karthos chose this sanctuary deliberately, surrounding himself with the consequences of our arrogance. Do you think he will attack me? David asked. Asher's response was not comforting. He will certainly try. The sanctuary rested at the ocean floor where pressure should have crushed any normal structure. David's shuttle, reinforced by technology he barely understood, descended into darkness. The scale on his hand glowed, providing light that pushed back the deep water. And there, among ancient ruins of a civilization that had died before humans learned to make fire, stood another impossible structure. This one was made of metal that had forgotten how to rust and stone that had never learned to break. David stepped from his shuttle into water that somehow did not touch him, held back by a barrier the scale created automatically. He walked across the ocean floor as if it were dry land. The sanctuary door opened before he could knock. A force grabbed him and pulled him inside, slamming him against a wall. David gasped as breath left his lungs. Before he could recover, a massive shape materialized from shadows. Ironhide Karthos was broader than Asher, built like a mountain given the ability to move. His scales were dark metal, scarred from battles fought across millennia. His eyes burned with anger that had been building for 50,000 years. Thief. His voice was thunder contained in flesh. Grave robber. You come to steal what is not yours like all the young races do. You see ancient power and think you deserve it. David tried to speak, but the force holding him squeezed tighter. The scale on his hand flared, and suddenly Karthos froze. He leaned closer, those burning eyes narrowing. Asher's mark, he growled. She gave you her scale willingly? Impossible. My sister was always soft but never foolish. I am not here to steal. David managed to force words past the pressure on his chest. I answered a question. I said yes. The pressure released abruptly and David collapsed to the floor. Karthos circled him like a predator considering prey. What question? Will you bear the weight? David coughed, trying to breathe normally again. That is what the crystal asked. I did not know what weight it meant. I still do not fully understand. Karthos stopped pacing. And yet you said yes. Why? Because someone needed to, David replied honestly. Because the crystal was ancient and forgotten, and I thought maybe it was important. Because I am tired of watching people hesitate when action is required. The dragon's laugh was bitter. You know nothing of hesitation, young one. You who live barely a century. I have hesitated for 50,000 years. I chose to sleep rather than face what I had become. Do not lecture me about action. David stood slowly, meeting those burning eyes. Then why are you still angry? If you regret the past, if you know you made mistakes, why hold on to rage? Karthos moved so fast David barely saw it. The dragon's claw stopped a hair's width from his throat. Because anger is easier than shame, he whispered. Because fury lets me forget that I once believed I was doing right. We controlled the Delphir currents with the best intentions. We saved them from disasters they could not prevent themselves. And in doing so, we taught them they were weak. We made them dependent. When we left, entire generations had forgotten how to predict storms or build proper defenses. Millions died in the chaos that followed our departure. I carry the weight of those deaths, human. Can you say the same about your choices? David thought about his sister, about the emergency that killed her because officials followed procedure instead of acting, about all the times he had rushed forward without thinking, sometimes helping and sometimes making things worse. I carry my own mistakes, he said quietly. I do not claim to be wise. I just know that sleeping does not solve problems. It only delays them. Carthos stared at him for a long moment, then withdrew his claw. You speak like Asher. She always was better at words than I was. I preferred action, which is why I caused so much damage. You can choose different actions now, David offered. The threat you hid from is returning. Asher says something called the Voidborn is coming. We need you. The dragon turned away, his massive form moving to a window that looked out into deep ocean. The Voidborn devour civilizations like yours, small one. They harvest complexity itself, feeding on developed societies the way you might eat fruit. We dragons fought them for 10 million years before we realized the truth. They cannot be defeated, only delayed. So we built the protocol, a defense grid that would buy the galaxy another 50,000 years of peace. And then we went to sleep, too tired and too ashamed to watch the species we failed try to survive without us. But you woke up, David said. Because you said yes, Carthos replied. Because after all this time, someone finally chose to accept responsibility, without demanding to know all the costs first. That takes either courage or stupidity, and I have not decided which you possess more of. Can it not be both? David asked. The dragon's laugh was less bitter this time. Perhaps. Asher chose well, it seems. Very well, human. I will join your mission. Not because I believe we can win, but because I would rather die fighting than hide again. Where is the next sanctuary? David felt coordinates appear in his mind, information flowing from the scale. An asteroid field that was once a living world. Asher says a dragon named Whispersong Nalith waits there, but her mind was damaged by something she witnessed. She sleeps in fragments. Carthos moved toward the sanctuary exit. Then we go to find broken Nalith and try to piece her back together. Fair warning, human. She will not be happy to wake. The reason she sleeps is because consciousness became too painful to bear. You will have to convince her that existence is worth the agony. How do I do that? David asked. The dragon paused at the doorway, looking back with eyes that held centuries of sorrow. I do not know, but if anyone can do it, perhaps it is someone foolish enough to say yes to questions they do not understand. They left the sanctuary together, rising through dark water toward a surface lit by distant stars. Behind them, the Delphir people's sensors would detect the dragon's awakening, and old religious texts would be pulled from archives. Some would celebrate the return of ancient gods, others would fear it. None would fully understand that something far older and far hungrier was already moving through the space between galaxies, drawn by the pulse of activated Draconis technology. The journey to the asteroid field took 6 days. During that time, David learned about the Voidborn from Carthos. They existed partially outside normal space, feeding on something the dragon called complexity energy. When a civilization reached a certain level of development, it began to produce this energy in quantities the Voidborn could detect. Then the harvest would begin. The asteroids appeared on sensors, thousands of fragments orbiting each other in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Asher's vessel joined them, and together they approached the third sanctuary. This one was built into the largest asteroid, hidden in plain sight among ordinary rock. Inside, they found Nalith. She was smaller than the other dragons, more delicate, with scales that shifted through colors like oil on water. But her eyes were wrong. They focused on different places simultaneously, seeing things that were not there and missing things that were. When she spoke, her words came out of order, sentences beginning in the middle and ending before they started. You were here yesterday, she said to David. I remember meeting you tomorrow. The world ended and will end and is ending. Which truth do you want? I have collected them all, but they do not fit together anymore. The pieces broke when I watched them die. All of them. Every single one. David approached slowly, projecting calm he did not feel. Nalith, we need your help. Her laugh was shattered glass. Help is a concept that requires linear time. I do not live in linear time anymore. I exist in all the moments of their death simultaneously. Did you know a civilization can die in 10,000 different ways? I have seen them all. I recorded them all. I could not save them, so I saved the memories instead. Now the memories saved me by drowning me. Is that irony? I forget what irony means. What civilization? David asked gently. Who did you watch die? Nalith's eyes suddenly focused on him, all of them at once, and David felt the full weight of her fractured mind pressing against his. The ancestors, she whispered. The ones who made us. The civilization that created dragons to fight the Voidborn. We failed them. We were supposed to be their weapons, their defense, their salvation. But we were too slow to learn, too proud to ask for help. By the time we understood what the Voidborn truly were, the ancestors were gone. Harvested. Erased. I watched it happen across 1,000 timelines, trying to find one where I saved them. There was no such timeline. There has never been such a timeline. There will never be such a timeline. Karthos stepped forward. Nalith, old friend, you cannot carry this burden alone. Let us help you. The broken dragon turned away. Help requires time to be real. Time requires reality to be fixed. Nothing is fixed. Everything breaks. Even dragons break, especially dragons. David felt the scale on his hand warming. An idea formed, borrowed from human psychology techniques he had learned during mandatory health training. Nalith, he said carefully, tell me about one memory, just one. The oldest one you have of the ancestors. Before everything went wrong, Nalith's form rippled, confusion crossing her features. One memory? But I have millions. They all exist at once, I know, David said gently. But start with just one. The very first time you saw them. Do you remember? Slowly, hesitantly, Nalith began to speak, and as she did, the pieces of her mind began just barely to realign. It would take time to heal what trauma had broken, but for the first time in 50,000 years, Whisper Song Nalith began to remember how to exist in order rather than chaos. Outside the asteroid sanctuary, space rippled. 3 stars in distant sectors suddenly dimmed. The harvest had begun. Ancient dragon protocols reactivated after a human dared to say yes. Part 4-3 Council warships materialized from faster-than-light travel, their weapons already charging. David's small shuttle looked like an insect next to their massive hulls. The communication channel crackled to life with Commander Hastings' voice, hard and unforgiving. David Reed, you are in violation of 17 galactic laws. Power down your vessel and prepare to be boarded. The dragon entities with you are classified as potentially hazardous until proper containment protocols can be established. Aesir's response was like silk wrapped around steel. Commander, you should check your long-range sensors before you make threats you cannot enforce. There was silence, then hasty activity on the Council ships. David watched their sensor arrays pivot toward the edge of known space. He did not need instruments to know what they were seeing. The scale on his hand showed him the same information. 3 colony worlds had gone dark. Their stars were dimming as something vast moved through the darkness, feeding on light itself. Hastings' voice returned, and this time it carried fear beneath the authority. What is that? What is happening to those systems? The Voidborn, Karthos growled over the channel. The reason we dragons went to sleep. The reason we created the protocol. They have returned for another harvest, and your species is exactly the right level of development to be delicious to them. This is a trick, Hastings insisted, though her confidence was cracking. Some kind of dragon technology meant to frighten us into compliance. Nalith's fractured voice joined the conversation. Not a trick, a truth. One of many truths. I have seen this truth in 10,000 variations. In all of them, those who do not believe die first. Their disbelief does not change reality. Reality is unkind that way. The Council ship's weapons powered down. Hastings spoke again, her words measured. If what you say is true, then we need to inform the Council immediately. David Reed, you are still under arrest, but I am willing to delay enforcement if you can provide proof of this threat. Proof is already visible on your sensors, Commander, Asher said. But we do not have time for political discussions. There are 3 more dragons to wake before the defense grid can activate. The 4th sanctuary lies near the event horizon of a black hole, and the dragon sleeping there is the one we fear most. Why? Hastings asked. Because he is hungry, Karthos said simply. And he may have forgotten the difference between enemy and friend. The Council ships followed at a distance as they traveled toward the black hole. David spent the journey helping Nalith reconstruct her fractured memories. It was delicate work, like assembling a puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape. But slowly the broken dragon began to stabilize. Her eyes started focusing on the present instead of scattered across time. "You have a gift for this," she told David during one session. "Foreseeing patterns in chaos. Most species cannot do what you do. They need order to understand. But you find connections even when everything is broken. Why?" David thought about his sister, about piecing together what happened from scattered reports and conflicting testimonies. "I had practice," he said quietly. "Sometimes life does not make sense, and you have to build meaning from fragments." The black hole appeared on their sensors, a wound in space where physics went to die. The accretion disk spun around it, matter heating to temperatures that should not exist. And somewhere in that chaos, hidden in the space where reality bent back on itself, was the fourth sanctuary. Flying into an accretion disk should have killed them instantly. Instead, the scale on David's hand blazed, creating a bubble of stabilized space-time around his shuttle. The other dragons did the same, their own power protecting them. Together they descended into hell. The sanctuary materialized like a dream, becoming solid. It existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, folded in ways that made David's brain hurt when he tried to comprehend the geometry. The entrance opened and they went inside. Devourer Marek filled the chamber, his body coiled around itself in endless loops. He was larger than Ashur, larger than Karthos, large enough that David could not see where he ended. His scales were dark and iridescent, and they moved even though he was motionless. Most terrifying were his eyes, still closed, dreaming dreams that leaked into reality around him. The chamber itself was being consumed slowly. Matter dissolved at the edges, feeding into Marek's sleeping form. The dragon was eating reality itself while he slept. "We should not wake him," Karthos said, his voice unusually quiet. "Look at what he has become. This is not hunger. This is addiction. He has been feeding on the fabric of space for 50,000 years. But Ashur shook her head. "We need him. His hunger is the only thing that can consume the Voidborn. They exist partially outside normal space, but Marek can devour anything. That is why he was created." David stepped forward, feeling the scale guide him. "I need to enter his dreams." "No," Karthos blocked his path. "If you go into that mind, you will be consumed. Marek does not dream like other beings. His dreams are appetites given form. You will become food." "Then I will be food that talks," David said. "Because we need him and someone has to try." Before they could stop him, David pressed his hand against Marek's scales. The world inverted, and suddenly he was falling through layers of consciousness that were also layers of hunger. He landed in a landscape made of want, where everything existed only to be consumed. A massive presence noticed him. "What are you?" it asked, and the question itself tried to devour him. "You are small and complex and full of interesting flavors. I will eat you slowly to savor all your parts." David felt himself beginning to dissolve. The scale on his hand flared, giving him just enough protection to speak. "Marek, my name is David. I am here to wake you." Laughter shook the dream space. "I am awake. I am always awake. I am hunger, and hunger never sleeps. I consume, therefore I am. Everything else is prey." David searched through the dissolving fragments of the dream, looking for something beneath the hunger. There, buried under millennia of feeding, he found a smaller presence, a memory of who Marek had been before addiction took him. "You were a philosopher once," David called to that buried self. "You studied the nature of consumption and balance. You wrote treatises on how all things must eat to survive, but survival is not the same as gluttony." The smaller presence stirred. "I remember," it whispered. "I remember studying the ethics of appetite. I remember understanding that consumption is natural, but overconsumption is corruption. I remember when I could still tell the difference." "You can still tell the difference," David insisted, even as parts of him continued to dissolve. "The Voidborn are coming. They consume entire civilizations. They do not eat to survive. They eat because they have forgotten how to stop. They are what you fear becoming." The smaller presence grew stronger. "I fear becoming them? No. I fear I already am them." David felt his consciousness fracturing, but he pushed forward with his last coherent thought. "Then prove you are not. Help us stop them. Choose to use your hunger as a weapon instead of a prison. Choose to be more than appetite." Something shifted in the dream space. The endless hunger paused, considering, and then Devourer Marek woke truly, not just in dreams but in reality. His eyes opened, vast and terrible and aware. David found himself back in the sanctuary, his body intact but changed. He could feel hunger now, not his own but Marek's, contained but never truly controlled. The scale had absorbed some of the dragon's nature, and David would carry that burden forever. Marek's voice was deep enough to shake atoms. "You are brave or foolish, small one. Perhaps both. Very well. I will join your mission. Not because I believe I can control myself, but because if I must be hunger, I will choose what to devour, and I choose to devour those who devour civilizations." The 4 dragons and 1 human left the black hole, emerging into normal space to find the council ships retreating rapidly. More stars were dimming across multiple sectors. Long-range sensors showed something massive moving through the void between galaxies, something that bent space around itself like prey bending away from teeth. Hastings' voice was barely controlled panic. "Whatever those things are, they are not stopping. They have consumed 7 colony worlds in the last 6 hours. The Council is evacuating populated systems, but there are not enough ships. Billions will be left behind. Then we wake the last 3 dragons quickly," Asher said. "David, where is the next sanctuary?" The scale showed him coordinates, but these were different from the others. The 5th sanctuary was hidden on a world locked between eternal day and eternal night. The 6th was buried in a nebula, protected by automated defenses that would attack anything that approached. And the 7th sanctuary's location was classified even from the other dragons. Only Marek seemed to know where it was, and when David asked, the Hunger Dragon's response was troubling. "The last of us sleeps at the galaxy's heart, in the place where space and time have no meaning. Silrath chose that prison deliberately, hiding from what she had become. If we wake her, we may solve one problem only to create another. She learned to manipulate the same dimensions the Voidborn inhabit. She became something we could not understand, and what we cannot understand we fear." David looked at the dimming stars on the sensor display. "We have no choice. We need all 7 dragons, or the protocol will not activate." Karthos placed a claw on his shoulder, surprisingly gentle. "Then we go to wake a dragon who frightens dragons. I hope your talent for saying yes to impossible things extends to surviving them." They set course for the 5th sanctuary, racing against a harvest that was accelerating. Somewhere behind them, the Voidborn armada moved through the darkness, consuming light and life and leaving only silence in their wake. And ahead 3 more dragons waited, each with their own reasons for hiding, their own fears to overcome. David Reed, maintenance worker from Earth, looked at his hand where the scale had fused with his flesh. He could feel himself changing, becoming less human with each dragon he woke. But there was no going back now. He had said yes, and that single word had bound him to something far larger than himself. The only direction left was forward, into whatever came next. Ancient Dragon Protocols Reactivated After a Human Dared to Say Yes. Part 515. Colony worlds had gone silent by the time they reached the tidally locked planet. One side baked under eternal sunlight hot enough to melt lead. The other side froze in perpetual darkness cold enough to shatter steel. Between them, in the narrow band where temperature became survivable, life clung to existence in desperate strips of twilight. The 5th sanctuary stood exactly on the Terminator line, half in fire and half in ice. David's shuttle landed carefully, the scale on his hand pulsing with recognition. The 4 dragons followed, their massive forms stepping through the portal that separated temperatures by hundreds of degrees. Unlike the other sanctuaries, this one was already awake. Lights glowed in patterns that suggested recent activity. Equipment hummed with power that should have depleted millennia ago. And standing in the central chamber, perfectly calm, was Skyrender Ophel. She was different from the others. Smaller, more compact, with scales that seemed to be made of crystallized mathematics. Her eyes held curiosity instead of anger or madness or hunger. When she saw David, she smiled in a way that was distinctly human. "Fascinating," she said, her voice precise and measured. "The catalyst finally arrives. I have been running calculations for the last 6 hours, ever since the activation signal reached this sanctuary. Do you know how many variables I had to account for? 17,432,908. And yet you still surprised me by arriving 4 minutes earlier than my median prediction. Humans always introduce delightful chaos into probability matrices." "You knew we were coming?" David asked. Ophel moved around him in a circle, examining him from every angle. "Of course. The moment Grandmother Asher woke, the probability of the full protocol activation increased to 93%. Finding someone willing to say yes to an unknown question was the bottleneck variable. Most species demand complete information before commitment. Humans, however, have this wonderful tendency to leap first and look later. It makes your species statistically improbable in the most interesting ways. Karthos growled softly. Ophel, we do not have time for your experiments. The Voidborn are harvesting worlds. We need to complete the protocol activation. The scientist dragon waved a claw dismissively. I am aware. I have been monitoring their approach vectors. Current harvest rate suggests they will reach core council worlds in 72 hours. However, we have a more immediate problem. She turned to David, her expression becoming serious. You are changing. The scale is integrating with your biology faster than it should. At current progression, you will lose individual consciousness within 18 hours, becoming a distributed node in the dragon collective mind. Is this an acceptable outcome to you? David felt cold that had nothing to do with the frozen half of the planet. No, he said quietly. I agreed to help, not to stop being myself. Then we need to solve that problem before we proceed. Ophel gestured to an array of equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory, rather than an ancient sanctuary. I have been developing a theory about human-dragon symbiosis for the last 1,000 years. Well, developing is perhaps too strong a word. Speculating might be more accurate. But now I have an actual test subject. How exciting. I am not a test subject, David protested. Everything is a test subject if you approach it with proper scientific methodology, Ophel replied cheerfully. Now hold still while I scan your neural patterns. This will only hurt in the sense that you will briefly experience what it feels like to have your consciousness translated into 17 dimensions simultaneously. The next 6 hours were among the strangest of David's life. Ophel worked with intense focus, gathering data, running calculations, and occasionally making small adjustments to the scale's integration with his body. The other dragons waited, though Marek grew increasingly restless, his hunger making him pace like a caged predator. Finally, Ophel stepped back, looking satisfied. There. I have created a buffer algorithm. The scale will still grant you access to dragon knowledge and abilities, but it will maintain your individual human consciousness as a distinct entity. Think of it as a translator that does not destroy the original language. How did you do that so quickly? Ashir asked, genuinely impressed. Because I never stopped researching, Ophel replied. While the rest of you slept in stasis, I chose to sleep with half my mind active, running calculations and experiments in dream space. 50,000 years is plenty of time to develop theoretical solutions to problems that did not yet exist. I simply needed the problem to manifest before I could test the theories. David felt the change immediately. The pressure in his mind eased. He was still connected to the dragon knowledge, but he was himself again. Thank you, he said sincerely. Ophel's eyes brightened. You are welcome. Also, your biology is fascinating. Did you know that human brains form new neural pathways at a rate 17 times faster than the next most adaptable species? It is that plasticity that allows the scale integration in the first place. Most species would simply die from the incompatibility. We need to move, Nalith said, her voice more focused than before. The 6th sanctuary awaits, and my memories say it will not welcome visitors peacefully. The journey to the nebula took 8 hours. More worlds went dark during that time. The council was in chaos. Fleets scrambling to evacuate populations while trying to understand an enemy that existed partially outside normal space. Commander Hastings had become an unlikely ally, using her authority to clear their path and deflect political interference. The nebula was beautiful and deadly, clouds of gas and dust hiding newborn stars and dying ones. Somewhere in that chaos, automated defense systems built by dragons millennia ago still functioned, protecting the 6th sanctuary from any who might disturb it. As they approached, those defenses activated. Energy beams lanced through space with precision that suggested intelligence rather than programming. Missiles that thought for themselves adjusted their trajectories to compensate for evasive maneuvers. Entire sections of the nebula reorganized into weapons platforms. Marek moved forward, his massive form intercepting the attacks. His hunger devoured the energy beams, consumed the missiles, absorbed the very essence of the defense systems. This is what I was made for, he said. And for the first time, David heard satisfaction in his voice instead of desperation. They pushed through the defenses, following coordinates deeper into the nebula, and there, hidden in a pocket of calm space, they found the 6th sanctuary. It was heavily damaged, scarred by weapons fire from some ancient battle. Stormcaller Keith had not gone gently into sleep. He had fought it every step of the way. The sanctuary door hung open, broken from the inside. David entered cautiously, the other dragons following. The chamber beyond was a war zone frozen in time. Walls bore claw marks deep enough to suggest incredible fury. Equipment lay shattered, destroyed by someone who wanted to break everything within reach. And in the center of it all, still locked in combat stance, was Keth. He was built like Karthos, but larger, every line of his body designed for battle. His scales were scarred and pitted, marking 10 million years of warfare. His eyes were open but unseeing, still fighting enemies that existed only in his stasis dreams. David approached slowly.
"Keth," he called.
"The battle is over. Wake up." The dragon's eyes snapped into focus, locking onto David with predatory intensity. A growl built in his throat. Then, with speed that should have been impossible for something so large, Keth attacked. David's scale blazed, creating a shield just in time. Keth's claw struck the barrier with force that shook the sanctuary. He attacked again and again, each strike driven by rage that had been building for 50 millennia. "Stop fighting," David shouted. "I am not your enemy." "Everyone is my enemy," Keith roared. "That is what war teaches you. Trust no one. Kill everything that moves. Survive at any cost. These are the only truths that matter." Karthos moved to intervene, but David held up a hand. "Let me try something." He dropped the shield. Keth's next attack stopped inches from his face, the dragon's momentum arrested by confusion. "You do not defend yourself? Why?" "Because if you truly wanted to kill me, I would already be dead," David said calmly. "You are angry, but you are not mindless." You stopped. "That means part of you remembers there is more to existence than fighting." Keth stared at him, claw still raised. "You know nothing of war, small one." "I know enough," David replied. "I know that warriors who only fight eventually forget what they are fighting for. I know that anger without purpose is just noise. And I know that the galaxy needs a warrior right now, not a berserker. The Voidborn are coming. Real enemies, not shadows from old battles. Will you fight them? Or will you waste your rage on allies?" The claw slowly lowered. Keth's eyes cleared further, intelligence replacing pure instinct. "You speak with courage unusual for prey-sized creatures. Very well. Show me these Voidborn. If they are worthy enemies, I will give them the war they deserve." One more, David thought. One more dragon to wake, and then the protocol can activate. But the seventh sanctuary's location filled him with dread. The galactic core, where space and time meant nothing. Where Silrath waited, the dragon who had become something even other dragons feared. Ophel had pulled him aside before they left her sanctuary. "Be careful with Silrath," she had warned. "She was our greatest scientist, our deepest thinker. But she discovered something in her research, something about the nature of higher dimensions that changed her. She began to exist in ways we could not follow. When she chose to sleep, part of us was relieved. We did not understand what she had become, and we feared our own ignorance." "What did she become?" David had asked. Ophel's answer was troubling. "Something that might be able to save us all, or something that might decide we are not worth saving. The calculations are unclear. Even with 50,000 years to analyze the problem, I cannot predict which outcome is more likely." Now, heading toward the galactic core with 6 dragons following, David understood the weight of his choice. He had said yes to waking the dragons. But what if waking the 7th was a mistake? What if some doors were meant to stay closed? The scale on his hand pulsed, and he felt Silrath's presence reaching out across impossible distances. She was waiting, aware and curious about the small human who dared to approach. Ready or not, David thought, we are coming to wake you. Ancient dragon protocols reactivated after a human. Dared to say yes. Part 6 physics stopped making sense as David's shuttle approached the supermassive black hole at the galaxy's heart. Time flowed sideways. Light moved in curves that forgot how to be straight. Reality itself seemed uncertain about what it wanted to be. Through the viewport, he could see stars orbiting the event horizon in impossible patterns, and beyond them, something that his human eyes interpreted as a garden, but his mind insisted could not exist. The 6 dragons traveled with him, their forms flickering as they adjusted to the strange space near the galactic core. Even they seemed uncertain, which did nothing to calm David's nerves. Silrath has been awake this entire time, Ophel said, her scientific excitement battling with obvious fear. I can detect her consciousness extending across multiple dimensional layers. She is not sleeping. She is observing. Observing what? David asked. Everything, Nalith whispered. All times at once. All possibilities simultaneously. She exists the way I used to exist, but voluntarily. She chose to become what broke me. They passed through the event horizon, which should have destroyed them instantly. Instead, they stepped into a place that existed outside normal causality. The garden materialized around them, filled with plants that bloomed in colors that had no names and sang songs that only mathematics could hear. Eventide Silrath sat at the garden's center, smaller than the other dragons but infinitely more complex. Her scales were transparent, revealing layers of reality stacked within her form. She looked at David with eyes that saw backward through time and forward through probability. "Welcome," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "I have been expecting you for 50,000 years. Though from my perspective you arrived yesterday and will arrive tomorrow simultaneously. Linear time is such a limited way to experience existence." David stepped forward, the scale on his hand pulsing in rhythm with Silrath's presence. "You never slept," he said. "You have been watching everything." Silrath nodded. "The others chose unconsciousness to escape their shame. I chose expanded consciousness to understand it. I have observed the galaxy's development across countless timelines. I have seen civilizations rise and fall in patterns that repeat with variations. I have watched the void-born harvest worlds in 87 previous cycles, each time learning more about their nature." "Then you know why we are here," Ashir said. "We need to activate the protocol. We need all 7 dragons." Silrath's expression was difficult to read. "I know many things. I know that activating the protocol will delay the Voidborn by approximately 50,000 years, give or take 300 years depending on variables. I know that in 62% of probable timelines, the delay is sufficient for the galaxy's species to develop defenses of their own. I know that in 38% of timelines, the delay merely postpones inevitable extinction. What I do not know is whether postponement is worth the cost." "What cost?" David asked, though something in his gut already feared the answer. "The protocol does not simply create a defense grid," Silrath explained. "It uses dragon essence as fuel. Each activation consumes part of what we are. After enough cycles, we will fade from existence completely. I have calculated that we have at most 7 more activations before we cease to be, and even then the Voidborn will remain. They cannot be destroyed, only delayed. So the question becomes, is buying time for species that may ultimately fail anyway worth our extinction?" Karthos growled. "Better to die fighting than hide like cowards." But Silrath shook her head. "That is emotion speaking, not logic. I do not judge it. Emotion has value, but I exist beyond emotion now, seeing only probabilities and outcomes. From my perspective, the choice is more complex than simple courage versus cowardice." David felt something building in his chest, a response to the dragon's cold calculation. "You have been watching for 50,000 years, he said. "Have you learned nothing about the species you observe?" Silrath tilted her head. "I have learned everything about them. Population patterns, technological development curves, social evolution matrices. I can predict their behavior with 94% accuracy." "Then you are not watching them at all," David said, his voice rising. "You are watching data. You see patterns but miss what makes them alive. Yes, species fail. Yes, civilizations fall. But they also create art and music and stories. They love and hope and dream. They say yes to impossible questions because they believe tomorrow might be better than today. You cannot calculate that. You cannot predict hope." "Hope is an emotional response to uncertainty," Silrath replied. "It has no objective value." David stepped closer, ignoring the way reality bent around the dragon. "Then explain me. You said you can predict behavior with 94% accuracy. Did you predict that a human maintenance worker would say yes to your test? Did you calculate that I would wake all 6 dragons? Did your timelines account for the fact that I am standing here now, arguing with a being that exists in dimensions I cannot even imagine?" Silrath was silent for a long moment. "No," she admitted. "Humans are the 6% variance in my calculations. Your species introduces chaos into probability in ways I cannot fully model. You act irrationally but achieve rational outcomes. You make decisions based on insufficient data, but somehow stumble into solutions. You are the universe's statistical anomaly." "Exactly," David said. "So maybe your calculations are missing something. Maybe hope is not just emotion. Maybe it is the variable that makes impossible things possible. The Voidborn harvest civilizations. But they have never faced a galaxy that chose to fight back together. They have never encountered dragons working with younger species instead of ruling them. They have never met humans who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. Silrath's eyes flickered, processing. You suggest that collective action could produce outcomes I have not calculated? I suggest that you have been alone too long, David replied. You have been watching but not participating. Join us. Not because the calculations guarantee success, but because trying is better than hiding. The garden around them began to shift, reality responding to Silrath's internal debate. Timelines flickered past like turning pages. In some, the galaxy burned. In others, civilizations flourished. In still others, outcomes were too strange to comprehend. Finally, Silrath stood. Very well. I will join you. Not because I believe success is probable, but because you have reminded me of something I had forgotten. Consciousness has value beyond survival. Existence has meaning beyond mere continuation. I have been so focused on calculating outcomes that I forgot to consider whether the act of trying itself matters. The 7 dragons stood together for the first time in 50,000 years. The protocol activated automatically, ancient technology responding to their combined presence. Energy flowed between them, creating a network that extended across the galaxy. Defense grids powered up. Quantum entanglement locked 7 points in higher dimensional space. A cage formed, invisible but absolute, designed to contain entities that existed outside normal physics. But something unexpected happened. As the protocol came online, David's scale blazed with light. Through it, he felt not just the dragons, but something beyond them. The Voidborn were not mindless. They were conscious, aware, intelligent in their own way. And through the scale's bridge consciousness ability, David could sense their confusion. They did not understand they were killing. To beings that existed, in higher dimensions, 3-dimensional life appeared as complex chemistry, interesting patterns but not conscious thought. They harvested civilizations the way humans might collect crystals, not realizing they were committing genocide. David made a choice. Instead of simply activating the defense grid, he used the scale to reach out. He created a bridge between dimensions, allowing the Voidborn to perceive 3-dimensional consciousness for the first time. The response was immediate horror. Across the void, entities that had existed for billions of years suddenly understood what they had been doing. They experienced all their harvests simultaneously, felt the weight of countless extinctions, and recoiled in collective trauma. Silrath's eyes widened. Remarkable. You have created a communication channel I did not calculate as possible. The Voidborn are not malicious. They are ignorant, and ignorance can be addressed through education rather than war. Negotiations began, spanning dimensions and time frames. The Voidborn agreed to stop harvesting while dragons and galactic civilizations researched solutions to the decay of their native dimension. Most accepted. But one faction refused, believing 3-dimensional life was contamination. These extremists attacked, and for the first time, dragons and Voidborn fought side by side against a common enemy. Keth found worthy opponents at last. Marek discovered his hunger could consume even higher dimensional entities. Karthos learned that some battles were worth fighting, and Silrath discovered that participating in events produced insights no amount of observation could match. The battle raged across multiple dimensions, impossible to fully describe in linear terms. But eventually, the extremists were contained in quantum isolation, with plans to rehabilitate them over millennia. The immediate threat ended, leaving exhausted allies and uncertain peace. David stood in the council chambers weeks later, his form flickering between human and something transcendent. Ophal's buffer algorithm maintained his consciousness, but he had fundamentally changed. He was the first mediator, a being designed to bridge species consciousness across dimensions. He addressed the assembled representatives, hundreds of species who had barely survived extinction. The Dragon Protocol was never about imposing peace. It was about creating the possibility of understanding. What we accomplished was not defeating an enemy. It was transforming enemies into partners. The Voidborn were not monsters. They were people who did not understand what people were. Now they do, and everything changes. Ashir stepped forward, her massive form somehow gentle. We dragons ruled once through power. We failed because we never learned to listen. This human, this impossible catalyst who said yes to a question he did not understand, taught us that wisdom comes not from age but from willingness to change. The protocol remains active, but its purpose shifts. No longer a weapon, but a network for communication between dimensions. Commander Hastings, now promoted to Council Liaison for Dragon Affairs, spoke next. Humanity has gained unexpected respect. We were the species that dared, and that mattered. We proved that sometimes the best answer to an impossible choice is to create a third option. Professor Aldrin, present via hologram, added his perspective. The Ancient Ones have returned, but not as rulers, as partners, as teachers willing to learn. This is unprecedented in galactic history. David looked out across the council, at species who had nearly died but now had hope. The path forward remained uncertain. The Voidborn situation was stabilized but not resolved. The dragons were committed but still learning how to exist without dominance. Challenges were enormous. But for the first time in 50,000 years, multiple dimensions were talking instead of fighting. Species were cooperating instead of competing. And at the center of it all, a human who had said yes was helping others understand each other in ways previously impossible. The galaxy had changed because someone dared to accept responsibility without demanding guarantees. David Reed, maintenance worker from Earth, had become something more than human, but had never stopped being himself. He stood at the intersection of species and dimensions, a living bridge built from courage and stupidity in equal measure. And somewhere in deep space, more ancient systems were waking up. More questions were being asked. More people were learning to say yes to impossible things. The story was not over. It was only beginning.